Sansa Stark stood at the balcony overlooking the royal courtyard in King's Landing, the midday sun drenching the pale stone in a merciless glare. She could not recall when she had last felt safe. Even in the earliest days of her betrothal to Joffrey Baratheon, when she had still naively believed in the songs and stories of chivalry, something in her had trembled with unease. Now, the gentle illusions had long shattered. She felt trapped in a castle of intrigue and cruelty, bound by her father's death and her mother's absence, with no choice but to feign obedience to the whims of the Lannisters. Today, the courtyard below bustled with soldiers drilling and servants hurrying about, but Sansa saw no warmth in their industry. She saw only a living tapestry of tension. She had been told the day before that her engagement to Joffrey was at an end. He was to marry Margaery Tyrell instead. Sansa had learned the news first from Cersei Lannister's thin-lipped sneer, then from the breathless gossip of the handmaidens and court ladies. Supposedly, the Tyrells' alliance was a matter of strategic convenience. Lady Margaery had captured the heart of the new king. Such was the official story. Or at least, the crown needed the Tyrells' armies and resources to consolidate power after the devastation wrought by the war. Sansa had felt an unsettling mixture of relief and terror when the betrothal ended. Relief, for she would no longer have to marry Joffrey, the boy who had tormented her and found petty delight in her humiliation. Terror, because she knew how precarious her position remained, unprotected by any alliance of her own. A young Stark in a city ruled by Lannisters who had orchestrated her father's downfall. She wanted nothing more than to escape to the north, to her home. But the north was a battlefield, her brothers scattered, her mother's fate uncertain, and Winterfell, her childhood fortress of safety, had fallen. The realization that the shape of her entire life had changed yet again weighed on her. She slipped away from the balcony with a nervous glance around, half afraid some Lannister guard might question her for simply looking too long at the training knights below. The corridor she took was lit by torches, the flickering flames casting uncertain patterns on the walls. At the far end, she paused at a large window overlooking the gardens. There, among the lush greenery, she saw Margaery Tyrell herself, standing tall in a gown of pale blue silk, smiling radiantly at a group of admirers. Sansa had only spoken with Margaery a handful of times, but each time, she had felt a gentle curiosity from the Tyrell lady, almost like a sisterly warmth. It was a strange sensation in this city of snakes. She descended the steps slowly, mindful of her every footfall, trying not to draw attention. She wanted to speak with Margaery, even if only to offer polite congratulations. Part of her was drawn to the older girl's confidence, to the way Margaery navigated court life with an easy smile. Another part of Sansa wanted nothing more than to flee from everyone. She was so terribly tired of all the betrayals and the pointed stares, the forced courtesy. But she reached the garden soon enough. Margaery's admirers had dispersed, leaving her with only her lady-in-waiting and an older servant who was placing fresh flowers in a vase. Lady Margaery turned her head at Sansa's quiet approach. At once, the warmth in her eyes was apparent. "Lady Sansa," she said, stepping closer and taking Sansa's hands with a gentle grip. "You look well this morning." Sansa managed a small curtsy, lowering her gaze respectfully. "Thank you, my lady. She hesitated, not knowing how to phrase her sentiments without sounding foolish. She cleared her throat, gathering courage. "I wanted to congratulate you on your betrothal to King Joffrey," she said, and it took a great deal of self-control to keep her voice from wavering when she named him king. Her own father had called him nothing but a usurper, but to speak that word aloud in the Red Keep was unthinkable. "I know it is a joyous occasion for all the realm, to see House Tyrell and House Lannister united in peace." Margaery tilted her head, seeming to measure the sincerity of Sansa's words. Her expression softened. "You are very kind, Sansa, but you needn't be so formal with me. We are almost sisters now, are we not?" Her lips curved in a gentle smile. Sansa could not help but smile back, though she could never quite rid herself of the anxious tightness in her chest. They spoke for a short while, exchanging pleasantries about the gardens, the newly arrived flowers from Highgarden, and the general talk of the court. It was all superficial, but the undercurrent was something else. Curiosity, unspoken questions that Marjorie seemed to hold behind her practiced grace. At length, the older girl invited Sansa to walk with her among the roses. The swirl of Marjorie's gown was as graceful as her voice, and Sansa found herself marveling at the Tyrells' ability to exude poise no matter the topic. Sansa quickly agreed, eager for a moment's reprieve from the prying eyes of the courtiers. The garden air smelled of roses, fertile earth, and the gentle perfume that Marjorie wore. As they passed deeper among the hedges, the hush of the Red Keep's walls made the world seem smaller, more intimate. Sansa's heart still thrummed with unease, but she wondered if perhaps she had found a new friend. It was only when they were out of earshot of any servants or guards that Marjorie spoke more freely. "Lady Sansa," she said softly, pausing before a bush laden with white blossoms, "I know how difficult this city must be for you. I know you are separated from your family, that you have had to endure cruel things." Sansa looked down, her hands tightening around each other as she recalled Joffrey's cruelty, the public humiliations, the beatings, the constant mockery. "I try to be brave," she whispered. Marjorie touched Sansa's arm gently. "You are brave. I have seen it in you. I know my grandmother has an interest in speaking with you as well. She is quite fond of you already." Her voice held a hint of wry amusement. "You must meet with her soon and talk. She is wise, and she wants to help." Sansa found herself surprised, unsure of how to respond. She had heard rumors of Lady Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, famed for her sharp tongue and sharper mind. The idea of being taken under that woman's wing both excited and terrified her. "I would be honored," she said at last. Marjorie smiled, and for a moment, the two of them walked in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of their dresses along the gravel path. Then Marjorie spoke again, her words chosen with care. "Sansa, I know what it is like to be caught in a web of alliances, to have your hand promised for the sake of forging bonds. You and I are not so different." Sansa felt a pang of something akin to hope. Perhaps Marjorie would understand. Perhaps the Tyrells, with their famed wealth and influence, could protect her in a way the Lannisters never would. She allowed herself to dream, if only for a moment, that she might escape this trap. Later that same day, Sansa found herself invited to a small luncheon with Lady Olenna. The Queen of Thorns did not suffer fools lightly, and her questions came quickly, laced with biting wit that made Sansa's mind spin. But she sensed genuine concern behind the old woman's probing. Lady Olenna pressed her about her experiences with Joffrey, about her loyalties, about her desires for the future. Sansa found herself stammering and blushing, but she told the old woman the truth. Joffrey was a monster, a cruel boy who took pleasure in tormenting the weak. The Queen of Thorns listened intently, nodding once, almost imperceptibly, after Sansa finished describing the Boy King's nature. "We suspected as much," Olenna muttered, shooting a sharp glance around the table for eavesdroppers. "But it's good to hear it from someone who knows him so well." Her gaze then fixed on Sansa, and there was a calculating glimmer in her eyes. "You are alone here. You have no powerful allies, none that can openly protect you. But perhaps we can help each other." Sansa's pulse quickened. "Help each other, my lady?" "Yes," Olenna continued, cutting a small piece of bread with decisive thrusts of her butter knife. "You are a highborn girl, heir to the north if something should befall your brothers. And you are ripe for a new match now that Joffrey has passed you off." Olenna took a delicate bite, then dabbed the corners of her mouth with a napkin. "One wonders if you might find happiness in a very different betrothal, far from Lannister clutches." Sansa felt breathless at the suggestion. She had heard the rumors that the Tyrells had once considered offering her a match with their heir, Willis Tyrell, the eldest son and future Lord of Highgarden. But she had never dared to think it could actually happen. "My lady, are you speaking of Willis?" Olenna gave an amused smile. "You are quick, dear child. Yes, Willis. He is a good boy, my grandson. He has an old injury from a tourney, so he is not the gallant knight his younger brothers are, but he is learned and kind. He has a fondness for the finer arts. He is not one to participate in cruelty and bloodshed. Perhaps that would suit you better than a savage little king." Sansa's cheeks flushed at the very idea of marrying someone else, let alone a son of House Tyrell. She did not know Willis, but the Tyrell name conjured images of gardens, music, warmth, and generosity. So different from the cold cunning of King's Landing. 1,000 doubts rushed through her mind, though. Could this be some elaborate trick? Would the Lannisters even permit such a marriage, given that Sansa was still their hostage in all but name? Yet the notion was intoxicating. If the Tyrells could pull enough strings to arrange it, perhaps she could finally escape. In the days that followed, Sansa was often in Marjorie's and Lady Olenna's company. They invited her to garden parties, to small gatherings of ladies, to feasts where the Tyrell bannermen mingled with Lannister allies uneasily. Through subtle inquiry, Sansa learned that Willis remained in Highgarden, overseeing various duties of governance. He was a private man, seldom drawn to courtly displays, preferring to focus on the agricultural, trade, and legal matters of the Reach. The more Sansa heard, the more she felt a cautious excitement. Could a marriage to this man not only rescue her from the Lannisters but also give her a life of relative peace? One evening, Marjorie took Sansa aside after a gathering in Maegor's Holdfast. They stood near a tall window, from which the faint glow of torchlight illuminated the courtyard below. Marjorie's tone was hushed, and her doe-like eyes flickered with urgency. "My brother Loras will speak to you soon. He carries word from Highgarden on our grandmother's behalf. It is important you tell no one else of what he says to you, not even your handmaidens." Sansa nodded, her chest tightening. "I understand, my lady. Trust us," Marjorie continued. "We want what is best for you, and if you are willing, we will try to arrange for you to be wed to our house. We do not wish to see you remain at Joffrey's mercy." Sansa swallowed hard. She could not imagine a future in which she had the courage to risk the Lannisters' wrath. But at the same time, the Tyrells were rising in influence. By forging an alliance with King Joffrey, House Tyrell had gained a powerful foothold in the capital, and their armies were needed to help cement the Lannister hold on the throne. If they truly had the cunning to manage this, perhaps it was her best chance. She felt an inkling of hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will do anything to leave here." In the following days, Ser Loras approached her during a midday stroll in the castle's gallery. His face was nearly as beautiful as she remembered when she had first arrived in King's Landing, but his eyes held a more somber cast now, no doubt from the hardships of war. He spoke politely, asking about her well-being, then quietly suggested they speak in private. They found a secluded corner near a set of tapestries depicting the history of House Tyrell. "My sister and my grandmother have grown quite fond of you, Lady Sansa," he said, keeping his tone low. "They believe you deserve a better match than you have been offered thus far. There are many in my family who would be honored to have you in our fold. My brother Willis most of all." Sansa tried to keep her composure, but excitement fluttered in her heart. "I would be honored as well," she replied, though her voice trembled. "I only fear what the Lannisters will do if they discover such plans. I am still under their watch." "They will not know until it is too late," Loras said. "We must act carefully, though. There is a question of timing. My grandmother wishes to wait until certain alliances are solidified. Once the Tyrell position at court is unassailable, we can present a betrothal arrangement. Or, if circumstances permit, we might have to escort you quietly out of the city." At that, Sansa's breath caught. A quiet departure from King's Landing, an escape. She could hardly believe it was possible. "If House Tyrell thinks it best, I will do as you say." She realized how desperate she sounded, but it was the truth. She had no illusions about her vulnerability. "Only, if I may ask, is Willis truly willing to take me, a girl with such troubles surrounding her name?" "He has already agreed," Loras said. "Word has traveled to him about your gentle nature, your courtesy, and the hardships you have endured. He believes the match would be favorable to both sides, and that you would find Highgarden a kinder place than this wretched court." Sansa felt tears prick at her eyes. She lowered her gaze for a moment to hide them. "I cannot thank you enough," she murmured. Not many days after, Lady Olenna engineered an invitation for Sansa to accompany Marjorie and some of the Tyrell cousins to the Great September of Baelor for prayers and charitable giving. It was a ploy, of course, an opportunity for them to move about the city without the usual Lannister guards. Riding in the ornate litter, Sansa sat close to Marjorie, who squeezed her hand reassuringly. The day was bright, and the city folk crowded the streets, curious to see the new queen-to-be distributing alms. Marjorie used the moment to sow goodwill among the populace, offering food and coin to beggars and praising the Tyrell generosity. Sansa saw how skillfully Marjorie manipulated the crowd's affection. She could not help but admire it, even as she worried about the Lannisters' watchful eyes. After prayers, the ladies lingered in a side chamber of the Great September, surrounded by stained glass windows that cast colored lights upon the stone floors. The High Septon had retired to speak with some other visiting lords, leaving them in relative privacy. Here, Olenna joined them, accompanied by a few trusted Tyrell men-at-arms who stood discreetly by the doors. "There is news," Olenna told them in a hushed voice. "The Lannisters are distracted. Reports from the Riverlands suggest that Robb Stark is on the move once again. Tywin Lannister has sent fresh forces north, and the Crown is eager to secure more gold from Highgarden. They are so desperate for coin and grain that they will have little attention to spare for what we do." Sansa's heart beat faster. "Does that mean I can—" She trailed off, unsure of how openly she dared speak of escape, even in these supposedly safe walls. Olenna narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. "We must decide whether to slip you out quietly or to wait until we can present the betrothal in open court. If we do it publicly, the Lannisters may try to block it. But if we remove you from the city in secret, that has its own dangers. We must weigh which risk is greater." She turned to Marjorie. "What do you think, child?" Marjorie glanced at Sansa, sympathy evident in her eyes. Sansa's position is fragile. She is a prized hostage, even if they no longer need her to marry Joffrey. A public betrothal might force the Lannisters' hand. They might harm her before we can seal the union. I would rather see her safely escorted to Highgarden, where my brother awaits." Sansa looked between the two women, trying not to shake from a volatile mix of hope and fear. To be whisked away to Highgarden to safety felt like a dream, but if the attempt failed, the consequences would be dire. She swallowed and found the courage to speak. "I trust you both. I only want to be free of the Lannisters' control." Olenna set her mouth in a thin line. "Very well. We will arrange for you to leave the city with an escort of Tyrell bannermen. It will look as though you are traveling to Highgarden as a guest of the new queen to see the wonders of the Reach. We will, of course, send word back to King's Landing that you are betrothed to Willis once you are beyond their grasp." She paused, focusing her keen gaze on Sansa. "Is this what you truly want, child? If you have any doubts, now is the time to speak." Sansa felt tears welling. She blinked them back. "I have no doubts. I want to be safe. I want to have a future that isn't ruled by the Lannisters." Olenna nodded, satisfied. "Then we must proceed with caution." In the nights that followed, Sansa found herself unable to sleep, imagining every possible disaster. She feared Cersei's wrath, or worse, Joffrey's malice. She pictured men in Lannister red cloaks bursting into her chambers at midnight, dragging her away to some vile punishment for daring to conspire against the crown. Yet no such calamity came. The Lannisters seemed preoccupied, indeed, with the war in the north and the ongoing negotiations with the Tyrells. When the day arrived for the departure, a small group of Tyrell ladies and knights gathered in the courtyard, their horses and carriages loaded for travel. Marjorie stood near the front, wearing a traveling cloak of light green. She embraced Sansa openly in front of the curious onlookers and said, loud enough for the guards to hear, "I so look forward to showing you the splendors of the Reach, my dear friend. You must see our famous fields of golden roses in bloom." Sansa nodded, trying to keep her face calm, though her heart felt as if it would leap from her chest. The Lannister knights in attendance seemed uninterested, assuming this was merely another frivolous display by the queen-to-be. The Tyrell retinue numbered perhaps 24, among them several capable swordsmen loyal to Marjorie's grandmother. Alongside them rode courtiers and ladies who would accompany Marjorie on her future visits to Highgarden. Sansa's plan was not entirely hidden. Some had to know her presence on the journey was unusual, but none seemed eager to question Lady Olenna's instructions. They rode out of King's Landing at dawn, passing through the city gates and heading south along the Rose Road. Sansa could not stop looking back over her shoulder at the towering walls of the capital, half expecting a host of gold-cloaked guards to come galloping after them. But no pursuit emerged. At length, the city receded into the distance. The road stretched on, lined with fields, gentle slopes, and small villages. The air grew sweeter, and the oppression she had felt so strongly in the Red Keep began, ever so slowly, to lift from her shoulders. For the first time in what felt like years, Sansa allowed herself to imagine a better life. The Tyrell party made good progress, traveling steadily each day, pausing at inns or relying on the hospitality of local lords loyal to Highgarden. At each stop, Marjorie was welcomed graciously, and she introduced Sansa as an honored friend from the north. The northern girl noticed that Tyrell soldiers guarded her with particular care. She was never left alone in a vulnerable position. This protection, subtle though it was, reassured her. Weeks later, they arrived at Highgarden. The castle was every bit as grand as the songs portrayed, with smooth pale walls and towers crowned with golden banners depicting the Tyrell rose. Surrounding the fortress were green fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with flowers and fruit trees. The Mander River wound gently near the castle's base, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. The approach to the castle was lined with gardens so vibrant and lush that Sansa's breath caught in wonder. She had never seen such splendor. Rose-covered arches, hedges trimmed into fanciful shapes, fountains that tinkled with water, marble statues of poetic grace. Welcomed by the steward at the gates, they passed into a courtyard filled with the music of harpists and pipers who played to greet their lady. The sound was jubilant, and Sansa felt a tear escape her eye as she realized this was not some cruel dream. She was truly here. She had escaped King's Landing. Inside, amid bustling servants and the soft glow of lanterns, Lady Olenna took Sansa's arm and guided her through winding corridors to a private solar overlooking yet another garden below. Marjorie followed, and there, by a large window, stood a man with a pronounced limp. He turned at their entrance. He was not as tall or striking as Loras, nor did he have the same brilliant armor or fabled beauty, but he had a kind, open face, framed by brown curls, and in his eyes Sansa saw immediate warmth. This, she knew at once, was Willis Tyrell. He bowed to her gently, using a beautifully carved walking stick to support his weight. His voice was soft and cultured. "Lady Sansa, I have heard much of your grace and resilience. I am honored to welcome you to Highgarden." Sansa curtsied, heart thudding in her chest. "My lord," she said quietly, barely finding her voice. I am grateful for your family's hospitality. More than words can say." Willis smiled. Sansa could see the kindness in his eyes, as though he truly cared about her well-being, not just the political advantage she might bring. When he spoke, he inquired about her journey, her comfort, and her impressions of Highgarden thus far. Sansa found herself relaxing by degrees. At last, Lady Olenna cleared her throat in a pointed way, ushering Marjorie out into the hallway to give them a moment's privacy. Alone with Willis, Sansa felt a rush of nerves. Their proposed betrothal hovered over them, unspoken yet urgent. But Willis did not press her. Instead, he spoke kindly about the castle's history, about the new stables he had constructed to care for injured horses, about the library and the orchard. Gradually, he guided her to a window seat where they could look out over the blossoming gardens. "I want you to feel at ease here," he said softly. "I cannot imagine what horrors you have endured in King's Landing. My grandmother has told me some of it, but I suspect there is more. In time, I hope you can trust me enough to speak freely." Sansa nodded, fighting a tremor in her hands. "Thank you. It was more than I ever thought I would experience. I was afraid every day. I tried to hide it, but inside I kept thinking, I would never escape. Her voice broke slightly, and she took a breath. I still can't believe I'm here. Willis touched her hand gently, his grip warm and reassuring. No one will mistreat you here. You have my word. My family sees this alliance not merely as a political arrangement, but as a chance to forge something better for the realm. We are not the Lannisters. The mention of Lannisters made her heart skip, but she mustered a smile. I already see how different things are here, she said, glancing at the sunlit gardens below. It's beautiful, truly. That evening, Lady Olenna confirmed the betrothal in a private dinner with Sansa, Willis, Marjorie, and a few trusted members of their household. The official announcement to the court at Highgarden would come the following day, and a raven would be sent to King's Landing. The plan, Olenna explained, was to force the Lannisters to accept the match through the weight of the Tyrell alliance. They need our food, our gold, and our soldiers, the old woman said bluntly. They would be fools to try to retrieve Sansa from us by force. That would mean war with the Reach, and with so many of their forces already engaged in the north, they can ill afford such conflict. Sansa listened, still overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. She had become a pawn once more, but this time, she dared to hope that the game might work in her favor. That night, she retired to a plush bed in a spacious chamber that overlooked the courtyard. She stared at the carved wooden ceiling for a long time, letting the foreign sense of safety seep into her. If there was a storm brewing with the Lannisters, at least she was not alone in it anymore. The Tyrells had embraced her in a way she never thought possible in a place of politics. The next morning, she awoke to a gentle knock on her door. It was Marjorie, carrying a tray of steaming tea and fresh fruit. Her face lit with excitement as she placed the tray on a small table. Today is the day we announce your betrothal to my brother, she said, her voice hushed with delight. Grandmother wants you to wear something fitting the future lady of Highgarden. She set about helping Sansa choose a gown of pale green silk, embroidered with golden thread in the shape of trailing vines and roses. It was a style that suited Sansa's coloring, and though she still harbored a shy streak, she felt a small thrill at seeing herself in the mirror. The reflection that gazed back at her seemed composed, regal even, like a high-born lady in the prime of her youth. She joined the others in the great hall, where the Tyrell bannermen and ladies were gathered. Willis stood at the center with Lady Olenna and Marjorie, while courtiers whispered in excitement. The Lord of Highgarden had sent word that he was in support of this match, though he was too frail now to appear in public for long. Still, his symbolic blessing was enough for the formalities to commence. Olenna made a short speech, praising Sansa's lineage as a daughter of the North, praising her courage in the face of adversity, and then announcing that she and Willis were to be betrothed with all due ceremony. There was applause, polite and at times genuine, and Sansa could hardly keep her voice steady as she recited the few words required of her. At the conclusion, Willis kissed Sansa's hand, and she felt the sincerity in his gesture. They would make a curious pair, she thought, he a quiet scholar with a bad leg, and she, a girl known for her beauty and rumored to be the key to the North. Yet she felt no aversion to the idea. In fact, she felt relief, something like gratitude. This was not the forced horror of marrying a sadistic boy king. It was a chance at a life that might be peaceful or at least less terrifying. That same day, a raven was dispatched to King's Landing to inform the court of the betrothal. Sansa tried not to think too hard about the reaction this news would spark. Cersei would rage, Joffrey would sneer and possibly threaten violence, and Tywin Lannister would brood over how best to retaliate. But the Tyrell position was strong. The Lannisters had no immediate means of compelling Highgarden to return their hostage bride, not without inciting the wrath of the Reach, and by extension, severely weakening the stability of the Iron Throne. 2 weeks passed in a semblance of calm. Sansa learned to navigate the halls of Highgarden. She discovered the library that Willis loved so dearly, with shelves upon shelves of books on agriculture, healing, history, and even romance. Sometimes she would find him there, reading by lamplight, scribbling notes on scraps of parchment. He would stand, leaning on his cane, and invite her to sit. They would speak of poetry, of the North, of the war that had ravaged the realm. He was not ignorant of politics. He simply approached them differently, with more reflection than bluster. Sansa began to see that he was, in many ways, the heart of House Tyrell's future. Strong in intellect and principle, if not in swordsmanship. One afternoon, as they walked through one of the many rose gardens, Willis confessed that he had once dreamed of being a great knight, like his younger brothers. A tilt gone wrong, however, had left his leg permanently injured. At first, I thought myself useless, he admitted, guiding Sansa along a path lined with red and gold blooms. But eventually I learned to love knowledge. I can serve my house by ensuring our lands prosper. We feed much of Westeros, you know? Sansa smiled. Yes, I've heard the Reach is the breadbasket of the Seven Kingdoms. She brushed her fingers lightly over a velvety rose petal. It sounds as though you have found your calling, my lord. Not all battles are fought with swords. He nodded gravely. Indeed, but the day may come when we must fight, if the Lannisters push too hard. We are forging a precarious path by taking you from them. He paused, turning to look at her intently. I do not regret our course, but I want you to understand the risks we face. I do, Sansa said, meeting his gaze. My family. We've been at war since my father was killed. I am no stranger to these risks. She hesitated before adding, I only wish there was a way to end all this bloodshed, to see my family safe again. Willis reached for her hand. Perhaps if House Stark and House Tyrell stand together, we can change the shape of this war. The North is vast and formidable. The Reach is wealthy and well-supplied. Even the Lannisters will hesitate to make an enemy of us combined. Sansa felt a rush of cautious hope. She squeezed his hand in gratitude. Thank you, Willis. I do hope so. That evening, as Sansa dined with the Tyrells, a raven arrived from King's Landing bearing the Lannisters' response. Lady Olenna read the parchment first, her lips thinning with disapproval. She passed it to Marjorie, who skimmed it, her eyebrows rising. At last, the parchment reached Willis, who read it aloud in a low voice, mindful that only a select few were gathered at the table. The Lannisters voiced concern for Lady Sansa Stark's well-being, as her legal guardians in the wake of her father's treason. Willis recited, shaking his head slightly. They request the Tyrells return her to King's Landing, that she might continue to reside under the protection of the crown. He snorted. Protection, indeed. Lady Olenna snatched the parchment back, scanning it again. Tywin threatens that we risk fracturing the alliance if we keep Sansa, she said, paraphrasing. He implies that we will not receive the same favorable terms for the shipments of grain and gold if we do not comply. Sansa's face paled. Are they going to force us to send me back? Olenna gave her a sharp look. Certainly not. We are not so easily cowed. But we must handle this carefully. Marjorie is still betrothed to King Joffrey, and that union must be secured before he or his family can retaliate. Once Marjorie is queen, the Lannisters will need the Tyrell support more than ever. Tywin knows this. Still, he is trying to use every lever he has to intimidate us. Marjorie leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. We will make it clear that our alliance with the crown stands firm, and that Sansa is here as our ward. Essentially the queen's beloved friend. We could argue that it was at my invitation she came to see Highgarden. Yes, Olenna said, tapping her cane lightly on the floor. We do not mention the betrothal to Willis in our reply, or we keep it vague. We will say we are in the midst of negotiations for a suitable match for Lady Sansa that will benefit the realm as a whole. If the Lannisters press, we will stall. The wedding of Marjorie and Joffrey is the key. Once that is done, they will not want to anger the new queen's powerful house by any rash actions. Sansa nodded, her stomach churning at the mention of Joffrey's wedding. She could only imagine the twisted ceremony, though she consoled herself that at least it would not be her wedding. Marjorie, for her part, seemed composed, as if she had long accepted what she had to do. But Sansa wondered at her true feelings. to marry a man she knew was cruel, to endure the closeness of a monster. Yet Marjorie seemed confident she could handle him, or at least, she put on a brave face for everyone else. Within a fortnight, Olenna had penned a measured reply to Tywin. She offered courtesies, reaffirmed the Tyrell commitment to the crown, and expressed polite confusion over why the Lannisters would see Sansa's stay at Highgarden as anything but a friendly visit. She concluded by wishing for continued good relations and the successful wedding of Marjorie and Joffrey, with the unstated warning that any serious threat to the Tyrells would jeopardize that wedding and the alliance altogether. And so it was that Sansa remained, and the Lannisters seethed, forced for the moment to play along. In time, messages from King's Landing became less overtly hostile, likely because Tywin recognized that the Tyrells held too many advantages. Yet the tension lingered, an undercurrent that no one forgot. As the weeks stretched into months, the shape of Sansa's life changed dramatically. Under Lady Olenna's strict guidance, she learned the arts of Highgarden courtesy and subtlety. She learned to navigate the political currents of the Reach, forging friendships with lords and ladies who saw her as a future Tyrell. She practiced dancing in the airy halls with Willis, who, despite his limp, moved with a certain grace of his own. She received letters from Marjorie in King's Landing, brief updates on the wedding preparations, hints of the intrigues swirling around Cersei and Joffrey. The notion that Marjorie had deliberately placed herself in that lion's den filled Sansa with a mixture of admiration and dread, but it also reaffirmed the cunning that Lady Olenna's brood possessed. They were not the unsuspecting novices Sansa had once assumed them to be. Occasionally, Sansa received ravens from her mother or from Robb, though these were few and far between. She learned that Robb was still fighting in the Riverlands, locked in a desperate struggle against the might of the Lannisters and their allies. From the tone of his letters, he was uncertain how to proceed, worried about alliances fraying. Sansa yearned to help. She realized that if she and Willis were wed, perhaps House Tyrell might be persuaded to lend some measure of support to the north, or at least to broker a truce. Willis himself seemed open to the idea, though he cautioned that it would take time and delicate negotiation. One morning, Sansa was strolling through the orchard with Willis when a breathless messenger arrived in dusty riding leathers. He knelt before them, offering a sealed scroll. "My lord, I bring news from King's Landing. There has been an event at the royal wedding." Sansa's stomach flipped. The wedding? She knew Marjorie and Joffrey's nuptials had been scheduled for that week. A grand affair with feasts lasting several days. Everyone expected it to be as lavish as possible, given the Lannisters' showy style and the Tyrells' sense of opulence. Sansa had prayed that Marjorie would remain safe, but something in the messenger's tense posture told Sansa that all had not gone smoothly. Willis took the scroll and broke the seal. He read silently, his eyes narrowing. Then he exhaled sharply. "Joffrey is dead," he said flatly. The words felt like a physical blow. Sansa's mind reeled. Joffrey, dead? She could scarcely believe it. "How?" she managed to ask, her voice faint. "Poison, it seems," Willis replied. "At the wedding feast itself. The city is in uproar. Marjorie is apparently unharmed." He scanned further. "They are accusing Tyrion Lannister of the murder, but no one is certain. The Queen Regent Cersei is outraged. The city is on edge." Sansa felt a flood of conflicting emotions. Joffrey's death meant an end to his personal cruelty, to the nightmare of him on the throne. Yet it could also ignite chaos. She worried for Marjorie. She worried for Tyrion, who had never treated her unkindly. She worried for the realm itself. "Is Marjorie truly safe?" she asked. Willis nodded. "According to this messenger, she is. She is no longer queen, not in truth, for the king died before the marriage was consummated. Tommen Baratheon has been named the new heir." Sansa felt a sudden pang of fear for Marjorie. Would the Tyrells now press her claim to be betrothed to Tommen? Or would the Lannisters try to blame the Tyrells for the poisoning? It all depended on how the politics played out. Willis clenched the scroll. "Grandmother will want to hear of this at once." They returned to the castle, finding Lady Olenna in a private chamber, already informed by another messenger. Her expression was grim, I had hoped to remove Marjorie from the den of lions eventually, but not like this. Now they will scramble to name her as the Bride of Tommen, if only to keep the Tyrell alliance intact. What of Sansa's position? Willis asked quietly. Without Joffrey, Cersei's attention might shift back to demanding Sansa's return. Olenna eyed Sansa. They may. Or they may have bigger problems now, trying to keep the city under control. Either way, we must be prepared. Joffrey's death changes the balance of power. In the weeks that followed, the realm reeled from the news of the dead king. The Lannister hold on the throne remained, but the lines of succession had twisted. Tommen was a boy, gentler than his brother, easier to manipulate. Meanwhile, Marjorie was quickly betrothed again, this time to Tommen, though the marriage would be delayed until the boy came of age, giving House Tyrell continued leverage. Cersei's rage simmered in the capital, but there was little she could do against her own allies. Sansa waited anxiously to see if the Lannisters would attempt to retrieve her, but none of their missives demanded her return with any serious threat. Tywin Lannister, cunning as ever, likely saw more immediate problems at hand, namely, stabilizing the throne under a child king and dealing with the ongoing war in the north. This lull allowed Sansa's betrothal to move forward. There were discreet talks between Tyrell envoys and certain northern loyalists who had found their way south. Through these channels, word reached Robb Stark. He was surprised, even stunned, to learn that Sansa had allied with the Tyrells. He wrote a tentative letter back, addressed to her and Willis both, expressing relief that Sansa was safe, though he voiced reservations about the Tyrell ties to the Iron Throne. Sansa read her brother's letter with trembling hands, sensing the lingering heartbreak he carried from the brutal realities of war. She understood his doubts, for the Tyrells had fought alongside the Lannisters just as easily, but she hoped that her marriage might help shape a more favorable future for the North. The wedding itself was arranged to be a refined affair, smaller than the grand ceremonies that might have occurred under different circumstances. With the realm in chaos, the Tyrells deemed it best not to flaunt their wealth too ostentatiously, so as not to provoke envy or suspicion. Still, it was lovely. The ceremony took place in the castle's sept, adorned with fresh flowers gathered from Highgarden's endless gardens. Sansa wore a gown of ori silk with threads of gold, her hair braided and woven with small blossoms that Marjorie had sent from King's Landing. Willis stood beside her, dressed in green and gold, leaning on his cane, his face serene but resolute. Lady Olenna, seated prominently, had tears in her keen eyes that Sansa suspected were genuine. The old woman had orchestrated much to bring them to this day. When the Septon pronounced them man and wife, Willis and Sansa turned to face the gathered nobles. She caught sight of a few familiar faces among the Tyrell cousins who had traveled with her from King's Landing. She saw watchers from Dorne, from the Stormlands, from the Crownlands, envoys who were there to gauge the newlyweds' influence. At the feast, which was held in a grand hall overlooking the Mander, Sansa and Willis sat side by side at the high table. The hall was filled with the mingled scents of roasted meats, spiced wine, and floral arrangements. Courtiers dined and danced, entertained by wandering minstrels. Occasionally, Sansa caught snippets of conversation about the war, about new shifts in alliances, about the growing tensions at King's Landing since Joffrey's death. But she clung to the fleeting joy of her wedding night, determined to believe that something good could come of this union. Throughout the evening, Willis remained attentive to her, checking that she was comfortable, that she had enough to eat and drink. He introduced her to various lords and ladies, always with a note of genuine pride in his voice, as though he truly valued her presence. She found herself blushing more than once, realizing how different this was from the hollow courtesy she had endured at King's Landing. Here, her husband's kindness felt real. When the time came for the bedding ceremony, a raucous tradition that often embarrassed brides, Willis gently dissuaded the rowdier guests from making a public spectacle. Lady Olenna supported him in this, putting a swift end to any bawdy teasing. It was enough that the marriage was sealed, no need to subject the bride to the indignities of an old custom. Sansa, grateful, let Willis lead her from the hall. The two of them retired to a luxurious chamber filled with scented candles and soft linens. Outside, the night sky over Highgarden was clear, dotted with innumerable stars. She was nervous, of course, but as they stood alone at last, Willis spoke to her in a gentle tone. "We need not rush anything you do not wish to rush, Sansa. There has been so much turmoil, and I would not want this night to add to it." She looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. She remembered how Joffrey had boasted of claiming her, how he had laughed cruelly at the idea of her fear. In Willis, she saw the exact opposite, a man who wanted her to feel safe. She touched his cheek, marveling at the tenderness that flickered there. She did not know if she loved him, not yet, but she felt a sense of trust. That was more than she had ever expected. "Thank you," she whispered. "We have plenty of time." They shared a tentative intimacy that night, marked more by warmth and compassion than by the frantic lust some might expect in a wedding bed. It was an unspoken promise that their union would grow from mutual respect into something stronger. Sansa fell asleep in Willis's arms, lulled by the soft chirping of nighttime insects in the garden below. For the first time in what felt like an age, she slept without the weight of fear pressing on her chest. The next morning, the sun rose on a changed future. Sansa Tyrell, she was now, at least in part, still a Stark by blood but allied to the Reach. Whispers abounded that House Tyrell might soon use this union as leverage to open negotiations with the North. If Robb Stark agreed to a peace or some new arrangement, then the Tyrells could effectively weaken the Lannister stranglehold on the throne. But everything depended on how the pieces fell. In the weeks that followed, Sansa began to learn the intricacies of Highgarden's management. Willis invited her to accompany him on inspections of the granaries, the vineyards, the fields that stretched along the Mander. She found it fascinating, the very lifeblood of the realm. The lords of the Reach prided themselves on feeding all the Seven Kingdoms, and with winter approaching, their resources would be more critical than ever. The politics of grain shipment, pricing, and distribution became topics Sansa paid attention to with a new sense of purpose. She was no longer a powerless girl caged in a gilded prison. She had a role to play. One afternoon, as she and Willis studied a map of the Reach laid out on a large wooden table, a messenger from the north arrived with an urgent letter. It bore the seal of House Stark, and Sansa's hand shook as she opened it. Robb Stark's words were brief but to the point. The war had turned dire. He had lost key allies, some to betrayal, others to the enemy's might. Winter was pressing closer. He asked if House Tyrell would consider sending even a token force to harass the Lannisters from the south, or perhaps lend provisions that might help his forces continue the fight. Sansa's heart ached as she finished reading. The letter did not mention her mother, and she worried about what that meant. She knew from earlier messages that Catelyn Stark had been at Riverrun, trying to broker alliances of her own. Now, if the North was on the brink of collapse, everything hung by a thread. She looked to Willis. "My brother needs help," she said softly. "I know you owe the Lannisters an alliance, but it was forged under such uncertain terms." Willis reached out and took her hand, understanding her unspoken plea. "We must be careful. An open declaration of war against the Lannisters would bring ruin to the Reach if we misstep. Marjorie is still at the heart of power in King's Landing, as Tommen's betrothed. But perhaps there are ways to covertly aid the North without breaking with the crown publicly." That same night, Willis, Lady Olenna, and several trusted Tyrell advisors convened to discuss the request. They debated long into the evening. Some were reluctant to cross the Lannisters in any capacity, fearing Tywin's retribution. Others saw an opportunity to destabilize the Lannisters' position, thereby strengthening House Tyrell's influence. At the heart of it was Sansa, standing quietly beside Willis, her fingers twisting together. If the North fell, what would become of her home, of her remaining family? The Tyrells might hold power in the south, but she did not want to abandon the Starks' cause entirely. Olenna tapped her cane on the tiled floor. "The Lannisters need our grain, and the realm needs stability. If we help the North too overtly, we risk Cersei's suspicion. But if the North collapses, the Lannisters grow stronger." that might not serve us in the long run either. We must tread lightly." She peered at Sansa. "My dear, do you know if your brother would be open to negotiation? A settlement that might end the bloodshed, if certain terms were met?" Sansa thought of Robb's stubborn honor, his desire for northern independence. He might, but he would want the North to be free or at least granted self-governance. The war started because the Lannisters. She closed her eyes, remembering Ned Stark's beheading. "They killed my father and threatened my family. Robb wants justice or some measure of autonomy." Willis listened intently. "Perhaps we can propose a treaty that grants the North broad autonomy under the Iron Throne. We could broker it using our position with Tommen's court. That might end the war without either side needing to destroy the other." Olenna inclined her head. "It is worth exploring. If we can get the Crown's acceptance, likely meaning Tywin's acceptance, then the North can keep their ways, and the Lannisters maintain at least a nominal overlordship. But it must be done carefully." She glanced at the advisors. "In the meantime, we may send discreet support, coin, supplies. Nothing that can be traced directly to us. Do you all agree?" There were nods around the table, albeit some hesitant. The Tyrells had built their power on caution and cunning, after all. If supporting the North covertly could weaken the Lannisters while strengthening the Tyrell hand, it might be a gamble worth taking. That night, after the meeting dispersed, Sansa wandered the moonlit corridors alone, her thoughts swirling. She ended up in the garden courtyard where a fountain trickled softly. She sat on the cool stone edge, letting her fingertips graze the water. She thought about Winterfell, about her mother and brothers, about how very far she had come from that bright-eyed girl who once dreamed of princes and tourneys. Now she was a wife, a fledgling political figure, part of a web that sought to reorder the realm. She heard a gentle footstep and turned to see Willis approaching. He looked at her with concern in his eyes. "Are you well?" She managed a small smile. "I am all right, just thinking." He nodded, easing himself down beside her, propping his cane against the fountain's edge. The moonlight bathed the garden in a silvery glow. "I know how heavy this burden is on you, Sansa. Your brother's life is at stake. Your home. I wish I could give you certainty." "I don't need certainty," she whispered. "I just need hope." She paused. "I used to be such a silly girl, dreaming of brave knights and valiant kings. I thought Joffrey was everything a prince should be, but that dream turned into a nightmare. Now, I see how complicated the world really is." Willis's hand found hers. "There's still room for dreams in this world, dreams of peace, or at least something better than the cruelty we've known. It will take work and compromise and cunning, but I believe we can forge a path forward if we don't lose sight of that hope." Sansa looked into his eyes, seeing a quiet determination there. He was no dashing warrior, no bold conqueror. Yet she found that she respected his gentle strength more than she had ever admired flashy swordsmen. She squeezed his hand back. "Then we move forward together." He nodded, and under the soft glow of the moon, they stayed there for a time, letting the hush of the garden enfold them. With the fountain's soft murmur, Sansa felt a small measure of peace settle in her heart. She was no longer alone, and perhaps, even in a land rife with betrayal and war, that could be enough to begin changing the tide. Over the following months, discreet shipments of supplies were funneled north through various intermediaries, men who did not wear the Tyrell banner openly, but who were loyal to certain minor lords in the Reach sympathetic to the Starks. Grain, salted fish, and even small amounts of gold for the purchase of weaponry trickled into the embattled northern territories. Robb Stark's gratitude came in coded letters, each time addressed simply to "my sister." He dared not put too many details to paper, for fear the Lannisters might intercept the ravens. But each letter thanked her, and by extension the Tyrells, for their unseen support. Meanwhile, the politics at King's Landing grew ever more complex. Marjorie, now a widow of a king who never truly became her husband, was engaged to the boy King Tommen. Through subtle moves, she and Olenna worked to keep the Lannisters dependent on the Tyrell alliance, ensuring that any aggression toward Highgarden would be self-defeating. They fed the crown's coffers when necessary, eased tensions in the city by distributing food to the poor. In return, they gained influence in the small council, pushing for moderation rather than unbridled vengeance against the north. Sansa watched as ravens brought news of the shifting tides in the war. Battles were fought, territories lost and won. She prayed daily that no harm would come to her mother or brothers. Willis stayed by her side, ever patient. He did not pretend to have all the answers, but he listened, offered comfort, and continued to help her find ways to assist the North. The two of them grew closer, forging a bond that surprised Sansa with its tenderness. She discovered in Willis a man who valued her thoughts, encouraged her to read and learn about the governance of lands, who teased her gently about her singing voice, and let her comfort him when his old injury caused him pain. In the quiet moments, they would walk through the meandering paths of Highgarden, talking of the future they hoped to see. A realm at peace, where the North could rebuild, where House Tyrell could flourish without the shadow of the Lannisters looming over them. Sansa felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. Here, she was not just a pretty ornament or a pawn. She had a role, and her voice mattered. Months after her wedding, on a mild spring day, a large party arrived from the north, having traveled under secret arrangements. Among them was Catelyn Stark. When Sansa received word that her mother was within the castle walls, she nearly fainted from shock and relief. She rushed to the courtyard with Willis at her side. There, beneath the warm sun, she saw her mother dismount, weary and travel-stained but alive. Sansa's eyes filled with tears as she ran forward, embracing Catelyn as though she would never let go. "My sweet girl," Catelyn whispered, holding Sansa close. "I feared I would never see you again." She pulled back slightly, taking in Sansa's new finery and the Tyrell cloak draped over her shoulders. "You look so much older, so different. But it is you, truly you." Sansa swallowed back tears. "Mother, I never thought to see you in Highgarden." Catelyn glanced around, her expression tinged with awe at the castle's splendor. "It was arranged by your grandmother by marriage," she said with a faint smile, turning to nod respectfully at Lady Olenna, who stood not far away. "We are to discuss an alliance in earnest. This was the safest place to do it." Willis greeted Catelyn politely, though he seemed almost shy in the presence of his mother-in-law. "Lady Stark, you honor us with your visit." Catelyn's eyes flicked between Willis and Sansa, noting their closeness. There was a moment of uncertainty in her face, but then she inclined her head graciously. "Thank you for taking care of my daughter." They moved inside for a private conference, along with Lady Olenna and a handful of trusted advisors. Catelyn explained the North's dire situation. Robb's forces were stretched thin. Winter was closing in, and the Riverlands suffered mightily under the constant threat of Lannister raids. Still, Robb had not yielded. He sought a negotiated peace, but only if it allowed the North to maintain a degree of autonomy. Catelyn's mission was to see if the Tyrells would use their influence at court to push for such an arrangement. Lady Olenna was frank. "We will do what we can, but it will require delicate maneuvering. Tywin Lannister is no fool, and Cersei's hatred runs deep. Still, they need our resources to keep King's Landing fed. If we threaten to withhold them, they will bend, if only to avoid open conflict." She paused, studying Catelyn. "But do not expect them to relinquish all claims on the North. We must find a compromise that spares more bloodshed." Catelyn's jaw tightened, thinking of Ned, of all that had been lost. "A compromise? Yes, if that is the only way to stop this war and save what remains of our lands and our people, I believe Robb will consider it." And so, over the course of several days, they negotiated and drafted proposals. Sansa observed quietly, sometimes offering a small insight into the personalities at the capital. Cersei's vanity, Tommen's innocence, the webs that Littlefinger wove. Willis offered strategies for leveraging trade. Lady Olenna sharpened every suggestion with her pointed commentary, ensuring no detail was overlooked. By the end, they had a plan. The Tyrells would propose to the small council a royal decree that recognized the North's self-governance under a renewed fealty oath to the Iron Throne, in name only. The Starks would be named Wardens of the North and hold the region's rule. In exchange, the North would halt all military offensives against the Crown. Robb Stark would release certain hostages to display good faith. The Tyrells would see that the Crown accepted these terms, or else threatened to reduce or halt grain shipments to the city. When Catelyn departed, she left with Sansa's tearful embrace, carrying letters that spelled out the Tyrells' backing of this plan. For the first time in a long while, Sansa felt that peace might not be just a childish fantasy. Of course, there were still 100 ways it might fail. The Lannisters were proud and cunning, but with each step, the Tyrells tightened their hold, building alliances that chipped away at Lannister dominance. In the months that followed, through countless bits of intrigue and subtle manipulations, through the steadfast presence of Margaery in King's Landing and Olenna's relentless cunning, the plan gained traction. Tywin Lannister balked, but he faced internal strife in the wake of Joffrey's death, Tyrion's trial, and the fractious relationships within his own house. He did not want to risk losing the Tyrells, whose support was crucial to maintaining Tommen's rule. Reluctantly, he agreed to consider the terms. Behind the scenes, documents were drafted, seals affixed, and quiet bargains struck. One autumn morning, a raven arrived at Highgarden bearing a sealed decree signed by King Tommen, acting on the counsel of his hand, Tywin Lannister. The decree confirmed that the North would be granted broad autonomy under House Stark, on condition of renewed oaths of fealty to the Iron Throne and a cessation of hostilities. The letter requested that a formal ceremony take place in King's Landing to ratify the accord. It was a victory, imperfect but meaningful. Sansa read the decree at Willis's side, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Felt unreal. Her father had died, her family torn apart, all for the Lannisters' ambition and the tangles of war. And now, at last, a semblance of resolution was on the horizon. Perhaps not the glorious independence Robb had once dreamed of, but a respite from endless bloodshed, a chance to rebuild. She pressed a hand to her face, wiping away tears. Willis brushed her hair back gently. "We did it," he murmured. "Or at least, we have done what we can to bring about peace." She turned to him, and despite all the sorrow that had led them here, she felt a surge of gratitude. "You did so much. Your house, you saved me from the Lannisters, and then you helped my family. I never thought." Willis shook his head. "We did what was right, and you have given us a strong ally in the North. If we manage to hold this fragile peace, we all benefit. That is what marriage alliances are supposed to accomplish, are they not?" He smiled softly, and she saw that old dreamers spark in his eyes. "I hope we can plant the seeds of something that will outlive all these petty wars." They gazed at each other in the golden autumn light, the courtyard of Highgarden around them. Sansa felt the burdens of her past, the weight of her father's death and her own captivity, easing ever so slightly. She knew the realm was far from healed. She knew the scars would remain. But she also knew she had found something here. An alliance, a partnership, and perhaps in time, a deep love that could grow from the kindness and respect they shared. And so, in a twist of fate she could never have predicted, Sansa Stark had aligned herself with the Tyrells, using marriage to break the Lannisters' hold on the throne. Little by little, their Rose and Wolf alliance had forced the Iron Throne to accept a compromise that spared the North from utter destruction. Although the memory of Joffrey's cruelty would never fully fade, and the Lannisters remained dangerous in their cunning, Sansa had risen above her role as victim and pawn. She was now a wife, a diplomat, a bearer of her family's hopes. Through her and Willis's union, the balance of power had shifted, and the realm teetered on the edge of a new era. One where the proud Rose of Highgarden and the steadfast Wolf of Winterfell stood together, bending but never breaking, sowing seeds of change in a land so often drenched in blood. In the years to come, bards would write songs of how the Northern Wolf found refuge in the Southern Rose, and how their unlikely bond tempered the fires of Lannister ambition. Some would say it was luck, others would say it was Lady Olenna's ruthless wit, or Margaery's careful maneuvering at court. But those closest to the truth knew it was Sansa's quiet courage, forged in the crucible of King's Landing, that had guided the alliance into being. She had learned the Game of Thrones through pain and fear, Yet she had found a way to use it not for vengeance alone, but for the hope of a kinder future. And in that future, though scars remained, the songs rang a little less hollow, for they carried the promise that even in the darkest times, roses might yet bloom and winter might yield to spring.